My family didn't just miss my wedding. They left 4 empty seats in the front row like a warning I was too naive to read. While I stood there promising forever, they couldn't spare a single text, a single excuse, not even a lie to soften the blow. I told myself it didn't matter, until a week later when my hotel chain hit a 9-figure valuation and my father suddenly remembered my number. His message was 4 words: family dinner, 7 p.m., no apology, no explanation. I thought I knew what they wanted, but the moment I walked into that room, I realized I was unbelievably, dangerously wrong. I wasn't born into a family that argued loudly. I was born into one that controlled quietly through expectations, obligations, and the kind of loyalty that feels less like love and more like a leash. Growing up in our house in Cedar Hill was like living inside an unspoken contract. My father set the rules, and the rest of us learned not to question why they only ever seemed to benefit him. My father, Roland Ward, believed legacy wasn't something you built, it was something you demanded. He owned 3 rundown motor lodges scattered along the state highway, each of them older than his ambition and twice as exhausted. He talked about them like monuments, like they were proof he'd carved his name into the world. But even as a kid, I could see the truth. The peeling paint, the sagging mattresses, the flickering neon signs that buzzed through the night like tired insects. He called it the family empire. I called it denial. My mother, Vivian, made sure we never said that part out loud. She wasn't cruel, just deeply invested in preserving the illusion my father built. If he was the architect of our world, she was the decorator, patching every crack with guilt and emotional pressure. Whenever he barked a command, she softened it with a story. He's under stress, Elias. He's trying his best. Don't disappoint him. Love in our house came wrapped in responsibility. Affection had conditions. Approval had prerequisites. My older brother Clark thrived in the system. He absorbed my father's confidence like secondhand smoke, thick, lingering, and impossible to escape. Clark walked through life with the conviction of a man who believed inheritance was the same as achievement. He never questioned my father's methods because those methods always benefited him. He was the natural successor, the one everyone assumed would carry the Ward name forward. Then there was my younger brother Theo, soft-spoken, charismatic, completely unanchored. He floated through school jobs, relationships, never choosing a lane, always expecting someone to clear the road for him. When things fell apart, he'd show up at home with wide, apologetic eyes, and my parents would rush to cushion the fall. Somehow, every mess he created became a family situation, and every solution became my responsibility. I learned early that being the middle child meant being the margin, the space where everyone wrote what they didn't want to deal with. But there was one person who saw me clearly, my grandmother, May. She lived in a small cottage behind our house, surrounded by wind chimes and stubborn rose bushes that bloomed even when everything else in the yard gave up. She taught me that love didn't need conditions, and boundaries weren't betrayals. When she held my face in her hands, her eyes were sharp with truth, not judgment. "You don't owe them your quiet," she'd tell me. "At some point, a man has to decide whether he's building his own life or renting space in someone else's." She was the only person who ever said things like that within 10 feet of my father, and she was the only one he never managed to control. I spent more hours in her cottage than I did inside the real house. She listened without interrupting, without turning my feelings into flaws. She let me exist not as a disappointment or a duty, but as someone whose thoughts mattered. When I started getting older, taking interest in architecture, hospitality, and business models, she was the first to tell me those interests weren't a rebellion, they were a beginning. But my father saw it differently. He scoffed whenever I mentioned design management or branding. He called hotels fluff and frills, insisting that the only thing that mattered was land. "Real business stands on dirt," he'd say. "Everything else is just decoration." Decoration. That was his word for dreams he didn't understand. When I turned 18, he offered me a job, no opposition in the family empire. A lifetime of replacing carpets in rooms rented by the hour, juggling overdue repairs, absorbing the frustrations of guests who deserved better. Clark treated it like mentorship. Theo treated it like free labor. My mother treated it like fate. I treated it like a warning. Instead of taking the offer, I moved out. Not dramatically, not with slammed doors or angry speeches. I slipped away the way you escape a tide quietly before it drags you under. I got a job bussing tables at a downtown hotel, something my father considered an insult. "You're cleaning up after tourists?" He sneered. Is that what you left the family for? But that hotel taught me more than my father ever had. It showed me systems hierarchy, guest behavior, crisis management. I watched managers do in one night what my father couldn't do in a year, solve problems without making people smaller. I learned how to read a room, how to negotiate calmly, how to carry myself with competence instead of fear. Every late night shift, every early morning cleanup, every dollar I scraped together, those were the bricks of the foundation I would someday build on. But at home, they wrote a different story. Dad called it rebellion. Mom called it selfishness. Clark called it stupidity. Theo called whenever he needed money. I became the black sheep, the outsider, the one who thinks he's better than us. Not because I bragged, not because I rejected them, but because I refused to make myself small. My grandmother kept me grounded. She reminded me that love without respect wasn't love at all. She taught me the difference between supporting a family and being consumed by one. When she died unexpectedly, the house felt suffocating. Without her voice to challenge the hierarchy, everything tilted back toward my father's control. After her funeral, he cornered me in the hallway. She would have wanted you to come back, he said. I looked at him and knew instantly he wasn't talking about grief, he was talking about labor. That was the moment I understood something I'd ignored for years. I wasn't a son in his eyes. I was a resource. And resources don't get affection, they get extracted. So I kept building my career. One promotion, one sleepless night, one tough lesson at a time. I rose through positions, saved every cent, worked side jobs, studied business models until dawn. When I opened my first boutique location years later, my father didn't congratulate me. He didn't visit. He didn't even ask how I was doing it. He only asked for help. And slowly, painfully, I learned the truth. My family didn't resent my success. They resented that my success didn't serve them. That resentment shaped years of subtle manipulation, little comments about obligation, sideways glances whenever I mentioned my achievements, pointed reminders that family comes first as long as family meant the people depending on me, not the people supporting me. By the time I stood in front of those 4 empty wedding chairs, none of this was new. Their absence wasn't shocking. It was confirmation. A lifetime of signs finally arranged themselves into one clear, unbroken line. I had never truly belonged to them. I had belonged to their needs. And for the first time, it was like something in me decided to stop. Pressure in my family never arrived as a single blow. It showed up as a drip, slow, steady, and unavoidable. One request became 2, 2 became 5, each one dressed up as duty, wrapped in the language of family, then handed to me like I'd earned the privilege of carrying everyone's weight. As my career grew, so did their expectations. It started small. Clark would call asking if I could take a look at some numbers, which always meant fixing them. Theo needed help covering a temporary situation, usually code for unpaid rent or a savings account drained on impulse purchases. Mom insisted Dad was too stressed to deal with the motel repairs, so she asked me to just step in for now. For now turned into 2 years. Every month another fire, every crisis my responsibility, every solution my pocket. If I questioned any of it, Mom had a script ready. Your father works so hard. Your brother needs guidance. Don't make things harder than they already are. Guilt wasn't her weapon, it was her native language. Dad never asked directly. He issued statements disguised as decisions. We're short on payroll. You'll handle it. This contractor is giving us trouble. Talk to him. We need capital for renovations. You can pitch in. Not can you help? Just an assumption that I would. And for a long time I did. Not because I felt obligated, but because I kept hoping my effort would eventually translate into respect. Maybe if I proved myself enough times, they'd see me not as a tool but as a son. But respect was something my father reserved for the people he couldn't control. And for him, I was always within reach. When my second hotel opened and turned profitable, I noticed the shift. Their calls became more frequent, the requests more aggressive. Suddenly, I wasn't just the responsible one. I was the solution to every mismanaged decision they made. They never asked how the business was going, never came to a single opening, never asked if I was exhausted or proud or scared. They only asked how much. Meanwhile, the motel's condition kept deteriorating. Peeling paint, leaking pipes, rooms left vacant because Dad didn't want to pay for repairs. Clark insisted it was part of a strategic downturn. Theo claimed the economy was to blame. Dad blamed guests for being too picky. No one looked at the truth they were running a sinking ship and calling it a legacy. I remember one night sitting in my office after a 14-hour shift when Dad called. No greeting, no preamble. We need 40,000 by Friday. I stared at the phone, exhausted, confused. For what? For the roof repairs, he snapped. You know this place keeps the family together? Don't make me explain why your contribution matters. My contribution. As if I weren't already helping in silence. When I told him I couldn't cover it truthfully because I had just reinvested everything into my newest property, he didn't listen. You're choosing strangers over your own blood, he said. Strangers. My employees, guests, partners, the people who actually believed in me. The next day, Mom sent a long message about how disappointed she was that I'd abandoned the family in their time of need. She mentioned how Dad hadn't slept, how Clark felt betrayed, how Theo was confused and hurt. Not one sentence asked if I was okay. That was the rhythm of our family. I carried the load, and they carried the narrative. But the real breaking point wasn't financial, it was moral. 6 months before my wedding, Dad forged my signature on a loan renewal. A high-interest predatory loan that should never have existed in the first place. I only learned about it incidentally when a lender emailed me by mistake. When I confronted my father, he shrugged. You weren't using your credit line, he said. You should be proud it's helping us stay afloat. Proud. I should be proud he used my name behind my back to dig the motel deeper into the ground. I didn't explode. I didn't threaten him. I didn't walk out. I simply looked at him and saw something I hadn't recognized before, a man who believed I was an extension of his will, not a person with autonomy. That night I sat in my car, outside my apartment engine, off hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I realized I wasn't tired. I was eroding. Slowly, silently, piece by piece. Still I stayed. Still I kept helping. Still I told myself families go through things. But the truth was simpler and sharper. They weren't going through anything. They were putting me through everything. And just when I thought the pressure couldn't get worse, my wedding approached. I had asked them months in advance, begged even. I told them the date, the time, the significance. I made it clear I needed them there, not as critics or judges, but as family. They promised they'd come. The night before the ceremony, Mom texted, "We'll try our best." I should have known then. But hope makes fools out of even the strongest men. And when I stood at the altar and looked out at 4 empty chairs, I realized the pressure wasn't tightening anymore. The rope had already closed around my throat. I just hadn't stopped breathing yet. People assume breaking points are loud shouting, slam doors, dramatic exits. Mine wasn't. It arrived quietly in the kind of silence that feels surgical. 2 weeks after the wedding, I drove to my parents' house, not to confront them, just to understand. A part of me still believed there had to be a reason, something human, something that could undo the image of those 4 empty chairs. When I walked into the kitchen, they were all there. Dad at the table, Clark leaning against the counter, Theo scrolling on his phone, Mom washing dishes like nothing in the world was wrong. Mom turned to me with a sigh like I was an inconvenience. "Elias, you should have called before coming." I stared at her. "Why didn't you come to my wedding?" They exchanged looks, silent, practiced, defensive. Dad finally spoke. "We had business to handle." "Business, my wedding, same sentence." Clark shrugged. "You picked an inconvenient weekend. You know how the motel gets in summer." Theo didn't even look up. "Yeah, man, we were slammed." "You should have been more flexible." Flexible? Like a ceremony could be rescheduled because they didn't want to rearrange their day. I felt something inside me shift, not a snap, but a release, like letting go of a rope that had been burning through my hands. "I gave you the date a year in advance," I said quietly. "A year." Dad scoffed. "Don't start with the guilt." We didn't skip it. We prioritized what mattered. That sentence moved through me like ice. What mattered? And it wasn't me, not even for one day. Mom wiped her hands and turned as if she were scolding a child. "You're overreacting. Weddings are symbolic. Family responsibility is real. Symbolic." That was at the moment I finally understood. They didn't see my pain as a consequence of their choice. They saw it as an inconvenience interrupting their expectations. "You didn't even call," I said. "Not a text. Nothing." Clark rolled his eyes. "You want us to beg for forgiveness? Grow up, Elias. Grow up." Coming from a man who still used my father's authority to prop up his ego, then Dad stood. He walked toward me with that familiar expression, the one that warned a demand was coming. "If you're here to dump feelings on us, forget it," he said. "We don't have time for drama. The motel needs attention. We expected you to show up last week and help. You didn't." There it was. My wedding wasn't an event they ignored. It was an inconvenience that conflicted with what they wanted from me. And in the cold, dull thud of that realization, everything aligned. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a lapse in judgment. It wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. They didn't come because they never viewed my life as something worth showing up for. They wanted me present only when I made their lives easier. I felt my voice settle low, calm, final. I'm done. Dad frowned. Done with what? Carrying this family, I said. Carrying your messes, carrying the blame, carrying all of you. Their faces shifted shock, annoyance, disbelief, but none of them recognized what was happening. Because they'd never imagined I could stop, but I had. That afternoon, standing in the kitchen where I'd spent my childhood trying to earn affection that was always conditional, I made a decision that didn't feel like rebellion or revenge. It felt like oxygen, and I walked out knowing I would never look back the same way again. The shift didn't happen in one dramatic moment. It unfolded slowly like a curtain being pulled back on a room I'd lived in my entire life, but never truly seen. After I walked out of my parents' house that day, I expected anger or guilt or some tidal wave of regret to hit me. But nothing came. Instead, there was a strange, unsettling quiet inside me, steady, focused, almost clinical. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to them. I was observing them. The next morning, I sat at my office desk reviewing invoices when a thought surfaced so clearly it felt like someone whispered it beside me. Stop helping them quietly. Start protecting yourself loudly. Ava walked in carrying 2 coffees. She studied my face the way she always did when something had shifted. You finally got there, didn't you? She said. I didn't pretend not to understand. Yeah, I answered. And I think it's time we verify just how deep the motel's problems go. Within hours, she had gathered every document tied to my family's properties, loans, invoices, tax filings, building code violations, contractor disputes. Some paperwork was clean, most wasn't. A few items bordered on negligence. And then came the realization that turned quiet frustration into ice-cold focus. Every major loan was in my name. Not literally, not legally, but functionally. My parents had used my credit, my reliability, my good standing to argue for favorable terms. They'd told lenders that their son Elias would ensure payments stayed on track. They hadn't needed my signature to use my reputation. A silent endorsement I never gave. Ava laid the files on the conference table like evidence in a trial neither of us had realized we were preparing for. They've built their entire lifeline on your stability, she said softly. I nodded. Then we take the foundation back. Quiet revenge isn't loud, it's precise. We spent the next week negotiating with lenders, and because the motel was hemorrhaging money, the lenders were more than eager to offload the debt. By Thursday afternoon, the transfer was complete. Through a holding company Ava set up, I controlled every note tied to the motel. Not out of spite. Out of self-preservation. That same evening, I sat in my apartment with the documents spread across my coffee table. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cruel. I felt something closer to truth. Like I was finally seeing the world without the fog of guilt they'd trained me to live inside. Then a knock at my door. My Uncle Victor, the only older relative who'd ever shown me the kind of consistency Grandma May gave without effort, stood there with 2 takeout bags. I heard things got tense, he said gently. Thought you might need dinner. We ate at my small kitchen island. He didn't ask for details. He didn't lecture. He just listened, nodding occasionally, letting me breathe. At one point, he placed his hand on the table, the gesture steady and grounding. May always said strength isn't how hard you can hold on, he murmured. It's how clearly you can let go. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that. The next day, I drafted the emails. Calm, professional, unemotional. Subject line. Notice of reassessment. Ward Motor Lodge properties. Body concise, factual outlining. The change of ownership of the debt, the review of operations, and the timeline for restructuring. No accusations, no emotional language, no insults, just the truth. Ava read them over my shoulder. Cold, she said, but fair. They taught me cold, I replied. I'm just finally using it. By the end of the week, every automatic payment connected to Me Utilities Insurance Emergency Contractor retainers was formally canceled, not cut off in anger, properly dissolved, legally documented. I didn't slam doors. I didn't make threats. I simply unplugged the machine they had plugged into me. And with every cancellation, every email, every finalized document, something in me shifted. Not revenge, alignment. For years, I'd been the silent backbone of a structure that was never built to hold me. Now I was stepping out from underneath it, not to crush it, but to stop being crushed by it. And when Dad finally texted me 3 words, "We need help," I didn't feel the old pull of duty or fear. I felt ready. Because this time I wasn't walking toward their world with open hands. I was walking in with clarity. And clarity is the one thing they never expected me to bring. The night of the confrontation felt unreal, too quiet. Too still, as if the air itself was waiting. Dad had texted family dinner. Important, a summons, not an invitation. The location wasn't the house this time. It was a private dining room inside the Ridgeview Hotel, one of the few places Dad still believed gave him status. The irony didn't escape me, a man drowning in debt, choosing a place built on luxury he could no longer afford. I pulled into the parking lot just after sunset. The lamps outside cast long golden bands across the pavement, and for a moment I sat in my car letting the engine's hum settle into silence. Ava's folder lay on the passenger seat. Copies of every loan, every transfer, every detail that proved I now controlled the fate of the motel. But I wasn't here to show power. I was here to show truth. Inside, the hostess recognized my name and gave me a look I couldn't quite read, sympathy, maybe warning, before leading me to the back. The door opened and every head turned. Dad sat at the end of the table, leaning back like he owned the room. Mom beside him, hands folded tightly, Clark with his usual smirk. Theo tapping his heel nervously under the table, and Victor, my uncle, sitting slightly apart from them, his expression unreadable. Dad didn't say hello. He pointed at the empty chair across from him. "Sit," he commanded. I didn't move immediately. I let the silence stretch, watched the flicker of confusion on his face before I finally stepped in and sat down, not submissive, not defensive, simply present. Dad wasted no time. "We've heard some things," he began. "Disturbing things." Clark leaned forward. "Is it true you've interfered with the motel's financing?" "Interfered. Interesting choice of word for saved you from collapse while you ignored it." Dad slid a stack of printouts across the table, statements, overdue notices, loan transfers. "You bought the debt," he said, voice rising. "Are you out of your mind? That's our livelihood." "No," I replied calmly. "It was your burden. Now it's your consequence." Mom gasped softly. Theo froze, eyes wide. Clark's jaw tightened. Victor didn't move. Dad slammed his hand on the table. "You had no right." I leaned back. The lender disagreed. They were relieved to sell. In fact, they said the property was weeks away from being seized. Clark scoffed. "You're exaggerating." I slid Ava's documents toward him. "Read the numbers. You know how." He skimmed, face draining of color as the truth clawed through his denial. Dad pointed a shaking finger at me. "If you think you can kick us out—" I don't think I interrupted. "I know the numbers. I know the contracts. I know the deadlines you ignored. And I know the motel hasn't been profitable in over 5 years. Mom's voice was brittle. "Elias, honey, we were going to fix it." "No," I said quietly. "You were going to let me fix it." Again. Without asking, without acknowledging, without caring what it cost me. Theo looked between us, panicked. "So, what now?" "You're shutting everything down." "I'm restructuring," I replied. "And restructuring starts with removing the people who caused the collapse." Clark shoved his chair back. "So that's it? You get one big valuation and suddenly you think you're better than us." I met his eyes. "No, I just finally see you clearly." Dad stood towering over the table. "You ungrateful!" "Sit down," Victor said suddenly. Everyone froze. My uncle's voice was calm but immovable, a tone none of us had ever heard from him. "Let him finish." Dad's face turned red, but he obeyed slowly, lowering himself back into the chair like the seat burned. I continued steady. "I offered a buyout, a clean exit. One you can walk away from without lawsuits or liens. You each get a modest payout. You leave the properties. I take over. No retaliation. No drama." Mom's breath hitched. "You want us gone?" "I want honesty," I said. "And the truth is, you never wanted the motel. You wanted control. You wanted me tied to you. And the second I built something of my own, you used every mistake you made as a way to pull me back." Dad's voice cracked. "You're destroying your own family." I shook my head. "You destroyed it when you taught us obligation mattered more than love." Clark slammed his fist on the table. "So you're cutting us off." "I'm setting boundaries," I answered. "The thing you all refused to respect." The room erupted. Mom crying, Theo pacing, Clark shouting, Dad demanding everything from explanations to apologies, all of them loud, frantic, desperate, but none of it touched me. Because somewhere in the chaos, Victor stood and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. And the entire room went still. Dad glared at him. "You're siding with him." Victor met his brother's gaze, steady, unwavering. "I'm siding with the person who finally stopped bleeding so you could keep breathing." The silence was heavy, suffocating. Dad looked at me with something new in his eyes, fear, not of me, of losing control. You walk out that door, he said, voice shaking, and you're no longer my son. I stood. No, I said softly. I stopped being your son the moment you decided being a father was optional. I gathered my folder, pushed my chair back, and stepped toward the door. Mom reached out, sobbing. Ellis, please don't leave like this. I paused just long enough for her to hope. I begged you once, I said, at my wedding. Then I walked out. Their voices rose behind me, shouting my name, arguing with each other, blaming unraveling. But once the door closed, it was all muted like noise from another lifetime. Outside, the cool night air hit my skin clean and sharp. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight slide off my shoulders. My phone buzzed. A message from Ava. Transition approved. They no longer have access to anything. I typed back, thank you. Then I stepped into the parking lot, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes, each step feeling steadier than the last. For the first time, I wasn't walking away from them. I was walking toward myself. The weeks after the confrontation felt strangely weightless, as if my life had finally shifted out of a gear I didn't realize I'd been stuck in. For the first time in years, my days weren't shaped by crisis calls, financial fires, or emotional debts disguised as family duty. There was space now. Clear, quiet space to breathe without checking over my shoulder. The motel properties transitioned into my control with barely a ripple. Contractors went in. Designers followed. Walls were repainted rooms, stripped down to the studs, old carpets torn out like layers of history that were never mine to carry. The buildings felt lighter each time I stepped inside, as if they'd been waiting for someone willing to see their potential rather than their limitations. I wasn't transforming the motels out of spite. I was rewriting the story. What was once a crumbling family burden slowly became a string of wellness retreats, spaces built around calm instead of chaos, presence instead of pressure. Standing in one of the renovated lobbies, sunlight pouring across the new wood floors, I felt something settle inside me. Not victory, not triumph, peace. My family's reactions filtered back to me through distant channels. Clark furious, Theo confused, Mom devastated, Dad silent, too proud to reach out, too shaken to pretend nothing had changed. But their emotions no longer sat on my chest. They were weather patterns happening miles away, real, but no longer mine to manage. One afternoon, I stood outside the first completed retreat, watching guests step inside with soft curiosity, unaware of the history beneath their feet. And I realized something I had spent years trying to avoid. Walking away hadn't broken anything. Staying would have. You don't lose a family when you set boundaries. You lose the version that depended on your silence. And sometimes that loss is the beginning. I wasn't rebuilding from ashes. I was building from truth. And for the first time, the foundation felt strong enough to stand on. If this story resonated with you, feel free to share your own experiences in the comments. Your voice might help someone else feel less alone. And if you'd like more stories like this, you're always welcome to stay and subscribe. This story is a fictional narrative created by the Kitchen Tables team for entertainment purposes only. It does not encourage imitation or real-world action in any form.